The account books are closed on the desk and the fire is almost out. The day a Victorian woman's husband died, she became, for the first time in her adult life, a legal person. She could own property, she could sign contracts, she could keep her own money. And within the same hour the mourning rules arrived, and she was expected to disappear. The crepe came first, that stiff, dark, specifically uncomfortable fabric, chosen not merely for its colour but for the quality of weight and resistance it carried. Then the veil, heavy enough to obscure her face entirely in public. Then the black-bordered stationery, the draped mirrors, and a timetable of social rules so precise that a widow who removed a single item of crepe 1 week too early could find herself the subject of conversations held in drawing rooms she was not invited to. What this story traces is not the rules as they appear in the etiquette books, where they look ordered and almost sensible. It traces the rules as they were lived, their texture and their weight, the strangest and most surprising corners of them. The hour the house went dark, the morning a woman reached for a pen and understood that the signature now was only hers, and the fire that burned low in a crepe-hung room at the end of the first, longest day. Under English common law, a married woman did not exist as a separate legal person. This was not a social custom that varied by household or region. It was a doctrine, coverture, and it operated in a precise and sweeping way. The moment a woman married, her legal identity merged entirely into her husband's. Not symbolically. In the formal language of the courts, she could not own property in her own name. She could not enter a contract or sign a lease. She could not sue or be sued as an independent party. Her wages, if she earned any, belonged to him by right. Any money left to her by her parents, any savings, any jewellery she'd owned before the wedding, all of it passed to his legal control from the moment of the ceremony. The law understood them as one person, and that person was the husband. What this meant in the dailiness of a Victorian middle-class marriage was something specific. A wife organised a complex household, managed a staff of servants, maintained an extensive social correspondence, supervised the children's education, and planned the entertaining on which her husband's professional standing partly depended. And she did all of this without the legal capacity to sign the documents on which any of it rested. Every lease, every formal agreement, every contract that gave the domestic world its structure had his name at the bottom, not hers. The moment he died, that arrangement ended. The legal term for what she became was femme sole, a woman alone, in the oldest sense the phrase contained. She could now enter contracts in her own name. She could accumulate and hold property. She could write a will. She could refuse terms she did not wish to accept. She was, for the first time in her adult life, a complete and legally independent person. This change happened instantly. Not after probate was settled, not after the funeral, not after a waiting period, not after any formal confirmation beyond the death itself. Some women understood this immediately. They had been quietly managing the household finances for years, and widowhood was one more practical transition to absorb. Others did not understand it at all, not until the solicitor arrived days later and began speaking to them directly, as the principal party in a legal conversation, with his questions addressed to her and not to the male relative standing nearby. The paradox was specific and could not be dissolved by looking at it from any angle. The worst day of a woman's life was the first day, under English law, that she fully existed as herself. Before the widow had time to absorb what had happened, the house began to change around her. The sequence was understood by every well-trained household servant without being stated. In a Victorian household that ran as it should, and a well-run Victorian household prided itself precisely on anticipating this kind of moment, the actions had already begun. The blinds came first. Every window on the street-facing side of the house was drawn to its lowest point, shutting out the daylight from within and the view from outside simultaneously. The house's visible face went dark. Any neighbour passing on the pavement, any tradesman arriving at the back entrance, any acquaintance in a carriage going by would see the lowered blinds and understand without needing to be told exactly what they meant. In a Victorian street of any residential density, this information moved through the neighbourhood within the hour. The mirrors were next. Every reflective surface in the house was covered, white muslin in some households, black crape in others, sometimes the dark holland cloth ordinarily kept for shutting up a house between seasons. The original reasoning, something to do with the soul and its reflection, something to do with the dead being unable to depart if they could see themselves, had blurred, by the middle of the Victorian era, into a general and unexamined propriety. It was simply what was done. A house in mourning had covered mirrors. A household that failed to cover them had committed a failure that was publicly legible, and the failure was read as the widow's failure. The clocks were stopped. The precise time of death was preserved in the hands of every clock in the house. The tall hall clock, the smaller one on the morning room mantelpiece, the one on the landing outside the bedroom door. The effect on everyone who moved through these rooms in the days that followed was both precise and uncanny. Time had stopped here. The world outside continued moving. Both of these things were simultaneously true, and the house held them both without apology. Speed mattered enormously to all of this. A household that moved slowly, that let the first callers arrive before the blinds were drawn or before the mirrors were covered, had committed a failure that settled in the social reckoning of the street on the widow personally. The house was hers now. Everything in it and about it spoke for her. A widow whose house was not in correct mourning order was a widow who had not understood what she owed. The doctor's arrival transformed a private event into an official one. He confirmed what the household already knew, and in confirming it, he initiated a formal chain. Under English law since 1836, every death had to be registered within 5 days. The death certificate, naming the deceased, recording the date and the cause, had to be filed with the local registrar, and once filed, the legal business of dismantling one life and reassembling another in a different form could formally begin. In households of the upper and middle classes, the widow was typically not the person who performed the immediate administrative tasks. A male relative managed the registration, her own brother if she had one, her late husband's brother, or the family solicitor acting on her behalf. This was understood as assistance and was received as such. It was also, in a particular and unspoken sense, the last performance of the old arrangement. A man handling the official paperwork of a world that had not quite caught up with the fact that the woman at its centre was now its legal authority. What the widow could not avoid was the solicitor's visit. He came within the first few days, sometimes within 24 hours if matters were pressing. He read the will. He outlined the provisions, what was held in trust, what was immediately available, what would take months to settle through probate. He told her, in specific numbers and specific terms, what her income would be, at least for now, and what her legal position was with respect to any debts her husband might have left behind, and he addressed her directly as the primary party in a legal conversation, which was not how he had spoken to her when her husband was alive. The solicitor of this period had a professional habit of careful, thorough explanation. He was accustomed to widows who had never seen a balance sheet. He was methodical, patient, and occasionally possessed of a thoroughness that, by slow degrees, shaded into condescension. Women who had in fact been managing the household accounts far more precisely than their husbands had sometimes found this approach a mild trial. But they were very polite about it. Victorian widows were, on the whole, extremely polite about things that were useful. For some women, the news the solicitor brought was straightforward. For others, it was not. Debts were a particular complication. English law exposed the widow to her husband's creditors in specific ways, and the discovery of debt she had not been told about, which was not uncommon in an era when financial matters were not considered an appropriate concern for a wife, could turn an administrative formality into something much closer to a crisis. The precise shape of a life, it turned out, was not always what it had appeared to be from inside it. There is something about a story where the worst day of a life and the first free day of a life happen at the same moment that I keep returning to. That paradox, a woman becoming a full legal person the instant her husband died, is genuinely extraordinary to me. Leave the detail that surprised you most and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. Subscribing keeps these stories finding you. Now, back to the house. The husband's body remained in the house. This was not an unusual or dramatic choice. It was standard Victorian practice across most of the social spectrum, and it shaped the widow's domestic world in the first week in a way that had no equivalent in any other period of her life. The body was laid out, washed, dressed, and carefully arranged, by female servants, or in some cases by a nurse hired specifically for this task. It rested in the bedroom where the death had occurred, or, in households that wished to receive visitors at the bier, it was moved to the drawing room. Both arrangements were considered entirely appropriate. What was not considered appropriate was haste. The expectation was that the body would remain in the house for several days at minimum, and in cooler months for as long as a week. The widow could visit the body as often as she chose, and was generally expected to. Extended sitting with the dead, simply being present in the room without particular purpose or activity, was not regarded as morbid. It was understood as a continuation of the domestic attention a wife had always given. To remain near him in this final period was consistent with everything that had gone before. Women who kept their distance were noticed. The social reading of that distance was not always charitable. The practical consequence was specific and daily. The widow moved through her own house with precise knowledge of which room she could not enter without encountering what had happened directly. She organized the household's operations around an unchangeable center, directing servants toward the kitchen and the morning room, receiving callers in the back sitting room, writing letters at the hall desk, while the house arranged its quiet daily life around the knowledge of the bedroom door at the top of the stairs. Not everyone who has experienced this can describe it precisely, but most who have experienced it understand without a description what it meant to organize an entire household around that particular knowledge. The Victorian vocabulary for this specific state, being the living authority in a house that contained the dead, was thinner than the experience it tried to name. Within 24 hours of a death, the condolence calls began. Sometimes within hours, if the death had occurred in the morning, and the neighbourhood was the kind in which news travelled efficiently. The social form of Victorian condolence calling was as precisely choreographed as any other ritual the period produced. Relatives arrived first, in order of closeness. Then came friends of standing, then neighbours of long acquaintance, then professional associates. The sequence was not casually observed. It communicated something about the family's place in the social world and about the widow's position within it. The widow was not required to receive all callers immediately. In the first day or two, she was entirely permitted to remain in her own rooms. A female relative, a sister, her mother, a trusted sister-in-law, received callers in the drawing room on her behalf, accepted calling cards, expressed the family's gratitude. The widow's absence from the drawing room was not read as remoteness or disregard. It was read as proof of the depth of her grief, which was a form of social currency, as legible and as valuable as anything she might have said in person. When she did appear, and she needed to appear eventually because extended withdrawal carried its own interpretations, her physical presence was governed by an unwritten but fully understood code. She sat, not stood. She wore at minimum the veil, even in a private domestic reception. She spoke in measured, quiet tones. She did not weep in front of acquaintances, though close friends and family were permitted a different kind of access to what she was actually feeling. Grief was meant to be present and visible, real, credible, and at the same time sufficiently contained that the widow remained coherent, polite, and an object of sympathy rather than discomfort. Some women found this impossible to sustain. Others found it genuinely a kind of relief. The condolence call gave a structure to a situation that had no natural shape, a role to inhabit at a moment when the widow's own sense of who she was had become uncertain. To be the widow receiving calls was at least to know precisely what was expected. In the first days of a widowhood, knowing what was expected was a form of stability. Jays of Regent Street did not wait for the widow to come to it. A note was sent, the goods were assembled from the standing stock, and a fitter was dispatched, often on the same day as the death, sometimes within hours if the message arrived early enough. The central commercial proposition of the mourning warehouse was not simply that it stocked the correct mourning goods, but that it stocked them before they were needed, in graduated sizes and in finished form, so that grief did not have to wait on fashion or on fitting. Jays had been established in 1841, 20 years before the death of Prince Albert would bring Victoria's personal mourning to wide public attention. The commercial mourning trade was already fully formed before Albert died. Jays kept complete widow's outfits assembled and ready in a range of sizes for immediate dispatch. A fitter came to the house with a small case of alteration tools, made the necessary adjustments on the premises, and left the widow correctly dressed before the first formal callers arrived. Speed was the product. Speed, under these social conditions, was the most necessary product available. The fabric at the centre of all of it was crape, a specific crimped matte silk, treated under particular conditions of heat and humidity to produce a surface that did not reflect light. It was not simply black cloth. It was a material with carefully cultivated properties, the most important of which was that it looked entirely unlike anything associated with ordinary life. It did not drape softly. It was stiff at the weave, scratchy at raw edges, and produced at every movement a dry rustling sound that was audible in a quiet room, a sound that accompanied the widow wherever she moved through her own house, day after day, for months. Crape could not be washed without destroying its finish. Rain turned it a distinctive mottled grey-green, streaked and visible at a distance. Both of these facts were widely known, and neither was a design flaw. The fabric was chosen in part for its quality of discomfort, because grief was expected to have a physical dimension, and crape provided it reliably. To wear it in warm weather, or to be caught in a shower, was to be reminded through the body of what the fabric represented. In its visible failures, It was a kind of report on the widow's movements. The cloth, in its demands and in its damages, was a form of discipline. The changes to the house extended well beyond the drawn blinds and the covered mirrors. A Victorian home in first mourning underwent a sustained domestic transformation that lasted through the full mourning period, and for a widow, the full mourning period was measured in years. The drawing room shifted in its arrangement and in its permitted uses. Furniture was moved toward the walls, creating a more formal and considerably less comfortable configuration. The piano lid was kept closed. Music in the Victorian domestic world was a form of entertainment and pleasure, and both of these were suspended for the deepest mourning. Fresh-cut flowers were removed. The association between cut flowers and celebration was strong enough in this period that their presence in a mourning house, except in the specific formal context of the funeral itself, was considered actively unsuitable. The widow's own rooms were the most thoroughly altered. Her dressing table mirror was among the first to be covered. The curtains in her bedroom and sitting room were drawn, and in strict households they remained at least partially drawn, for the full year of first mourning, filtering the light to a diffused grey half-light, rather than the full illumination of an English day. The effect experienced over months was of living in a space permanently between states, not dark, not bright, filtered to a sustained dusk. This quality of light became a daily constant, and the first time a widow opened the curtains fully, when mourning permitted it, the room looked genuinely strange to her. Crape-absorbed sound. A room hung with a significant quantity of it is noticeably quieter than itself, muffled at the edges in a way that is both physical and atmospheric. Combined with drawn curtains, removed ornaments, and the general suspension of household music, the mourning house had a particular sensory quality. It pressed in slightly. It held a specific indoor quiet that was unlike any other quiet those rooms had contained. The widow moved through this environment every day. It moved through her in return. By the time the first day ended, and it ended late, because the formalities of Victorian death had no interest in anyone's capacity for exhaustion, the house had been transformed, the doctor had come, the solicitor had been sent for, the callers had arrived and been received, and the widow was at the end of something she had not fully known she was crossing until she reached the other side of it. The first night alone. Women who wrote about it afterward, in letters, in diaries, in the private documents that were the only spaces in which a Victorian woman of this period could say, without performing, what was actually true, described it with a consistency that suggests the experience was more universal than the individual. It was not emptiness. It was not only sadness, though sadness was entirely present. It had a spatial quality, a texture belonging to this particular room, this particular darkness, this particular silence. The room had been his room. The darkness in it was a darkness she had known shared. The silence that settled into the space his presence had occupied was not absence. It had mass. It had a specific shape that had nothing to do with nothing. Some widows moved out of the shared bedroom that first night with the help of a female relative into a guest room or a room that had been hers before the marriage. Others stayed. There was unusually no rule about this. One of the very few decisions of that entire first day that belonged entirely to her. The absence of guidance was, for some women, more disorienting than any rule they had followed all day. The rules, at least, had told her where to stand and what to say, and how to hold her face when the callers looked at her. This one decision, a room, a pillow, a specific quality of dark, was hers alone. She made it in a house already changed around her, and a life already changed beneath her, with the candle burning low on the bedside table and the crape on the curtains holding the night outside at a small and insufficient distance. The fire in the grate had burned down to its last embers. The house settled into a silence it had not known before. The particular silence of first morning, which was quieter than ordinary quiet, and heavier than any other quiet those rooms had held. And in the morning, the first year would begin in earnest, with rules, a timetable measured in months, and a commercial infrastructure that had been assembled and waiting long before the grief arrived. The timetable had costume. It was not one costume, but a sequence of them, each prescribed for a specific stage of mourning, each governed by rules that changed at a specific point in the calendar of grief. The first question asked of a widow's dress, by neighbours, by callers, by women who understood the system because they had lived it, was not whether it was becoming, it was whether it was correct. The fabric at the foundation of the system was crape, and crape was worth understanding in more technical detail than its colour suggested. Samuel Courtauld and Company, operating from their mills in Essex, produced the dominant variety of Victorian mourning crape, effectively a near monopoly on an enormously profitable specialty fabric. The manufacturing process involved weaving a tightly spun silk thread. The finished cloth was then treated under conditions of heat and steam. Mechanical crimping set the characteristic rippled texture permanently into the weave. This treatment was what gave crape its particular surface. It was also what made crape irreplaceable. The crimp was set once. It could not be reset. Any contact with water, washing, steaming, or being caught in rain disrupted the crimp permanently. This was not a flaw in the product. It was, in a commercial sense, a feature. Crape was designed to be worn and then replaced, not worn and then laundered. The fabric deteriorated relatively quickly under sustained daily wear, and it deteriorated in ways that were visible. A crape gown that has been worn heavily for 6 months looked different from a new one, slightly less matte, slightly less crisp, and the difference was readable to anyone who knew the fabric. The mourning trade had built an entire industry on this relationship, and the industry understood it very well. The quality that distinguished crape from every other black fabric was its refusal to shine. Ordinary silk takes a finish. It reflects light. This is a large part of its appeal. Crape did not. The matte surface was achieved by specifically avoiding the finishing processes that would have given the silk any luster. A sheen on mourning fabric was considered, in the precise social vocabulary of the period, almost indecent, a reminder of ornament and celebration at a moment when both had been entirely suspended. Crape looked like grief. That was exactly and deliberately the point. The full first morning costume extended far beyond the dress itself. The widow's bonnet was a deep-crowned, narrow-brimmed structure in black crape, with the long widow's veil attached and falling down the back and sides of the head. The brim was narrow enough that it offered no shade to the features. The veil performed that function. The bonnet carried no decoration, no ribbon, no trimming, no pin at the crown. Any ornament on a first morning bonnet was a mistake, and mistakes of this kind were the sort that callers noticed and discussed afterward in the carriage going home. The dress itself was black throughout. In deepest first morning, the surface of the gown was covered with crape, not merely trimmed at the hem, but covered, so that the underlying fabric was largely invisible beneath it. The prescribed fabrics for the body of the dress were bombazine, parramatta, or crape directly. Bombazine was a twilled cloth of silk and worsted with its own particular dullness, heavier than parramatta, slightly more formal in its weight and texture. Parramatta was lighter and more yielding, better suited to warmer seasons or the later stages of first morning. Both were dyed a deep, flat black. Both communicated to any woman who understood the system a specific position within the mourning timeline. A widow's fabric was a form of notation. Gloves were black kid, always in first mourning. Black kid gloves showed every mark and were essentially impossible to clean without causing further damage, which meant they required frequent replacement, an ongoing expense that added to the already considerable cost of the full mourning wardrobe. Handkerchiefs were white, edged with a black border, one of the very few white elements permitted in first mourning, serving a practical function as well as a symbolic one. Boots were black. Petticoats, invisible beneath the skirt, were black in strict households, a detail that served no audience but the widow herself. This suggests either a thoroughness of conviction that permeated even the invisible layers of a life, or the particular private comfort of knowing that nothing, anywhere on the body, had been done incorrectly. The widow's veil in first mourning was not the delicate face veil of a wedding or the short half veil of an ordinary afternoon hat. It was a long, substantial crape veil falling from the bonnet brim to well below the waist, and in the most formal interpretations of first mourning dress, extending toward the hem of the skirt itself. It was heavy enough to drape stiffly. When the widow moved, the veil moved a half moment after, a shadow that arrived slightly late and departed with reluctance. In public, the veil was worn down. This was not optional or contextual. The expectation was that a widow in first mourning moved through public space, the street, the carriage, the church, with her features obscured. Her silhouette announced her status at a distance. The combination of black bonnet, long crape veil, and covered dress was immediately readable. But the person wearing that silhouette was not quite accessible. Her expressions were not visible. Her eyes could not be met. She moved through the street as a recognized type, present, and simultaneously not quite there. This was, in its way, exactly what the system intended. The physical experience of wearing a crape veil in variable English weather had its own requirements. In high humidity, and London supplied high humidity with considerable reliability, crape became heavier and more pressing without becoming softer. In cold weather, the veil had a specific dry weight that settled across the shoulders. In warm weather, the additional layer of fabric over the face trapped heat, in a way that was, over a long morning of calls, quietly exhausting. The widow learned to manage this without comment. Complaints about the physical experience of mourning were not part of the available vocabulary. In a private domestic reception, her own drawing room, her closest family and friends, the veil could be lifted back over the bonnet. This was one of the small and largely unmarked permissions of the system, to be seen in her own house by people who already knew her. The veil going up was a form of intimacy, and knowing which gatherings permitted it and which required it to stay down was one more calculation the widow made and managed silently, alone. After 12 months of first mourning, sometimes longer, in households that observed the full formal period more strictly, the timetable permitted a transition. This transition was not the arrival of colour. It was more modest than that. What changed principally was the crape. Second mourning removed the requirement for crape as the primary and covering fabric. The widow still wore black. This did not change, but the black could now be softer in its texture and more varied in its surface. Bombazine remained appropriate. Parramatta remained appropriate. Plain black cashmere, with its different quality of warmth and drape, became permissible. Black silk, plain, undressed, without crape trimming required, could appear. The surface of the wardrobe became by very small and measured degrees more ordinary, not less black, simply less deliberately uncomfortable. The social permissions of second mourning extended slightly beyond the wardrobe. A widow in second mourning could accept invitations that first mourning had closed to her. Small, quiet social gatherings in private homes, morning visits of a slightly less formal character. She could not attend the theatre. She could not attend a concert. She could not appear at any event where entertainment, in the public sense of the word, was the primary purpose. But the drawing rooms of close friends opened a little more. The world let a little more air in, not much, but perceptibly more than nothing. The first day of second mourning dress was its own particular experience. The widow wore black that did not produce the specific rustle of crape. She wore black that fell differently, that had a softer give, a less insistent quality against the body. The weight was not gone, but it no longer pressed with the same intention. This was what the timetable had given her after a year of correct observance. A slightly softer black and one or two more drawing rooms to visit. The jewellery rules shifted with the stage. In first mourning, the permitted materials were jet and black enamel. Nothing that caught light in a way that might suggest ornament in the celebratory sense. Jet was a specific material, not simply black stone. It was a type of fossilised wood found primarily in the cliffs near Whitby on the Yorkshire coast. True Whitby jet was dense and warm to the touch in a way that glass was not. It took a high polish that produced a deep, still black without any edge of reflection. It was carved into brooches, earrings, necklaces, rings and watch chains, an entire ornamental vocabulary expressed in a single unvarying shade. The Whitby jet industry grew substantially throughout the Victorian period, sustained almost entirely by the mourning trade. French jet, black glass, not fossilised wood, was cheaper and far more widely available. In a drawing room, a widow wearing French jet and a widow wearing Whitby jet appeared nearly identical across the room. The difference was tactile. The specific warmth and density of real jet against the skin, a quality that glass could not replicate. Whether this distinction mattered socially depended entirely on the drawing room. In certain circles it mattered considerably. In others, the primary concern was that the jewellery be black, which both varieties reliably were. In second mourning, small amounts of gold became permissible, pearls became permissible, and hair jewellery, which occupied its own particular emotional category, was permissible throughout every stage of mourning, from the very first day onward. Hair jewellery was made from the actual hair of the dead, cut at the time of death, or taken from hair collected during life. It was worked by specialist craftspeople into settings that ranged from simple lockets containing a pressed lock of hair to intricate woven pieces, brooches, rings, bracelets, and watch chains made from hair plaited into fine braids, set under glass, and mounted in gold. The widow wore the dead person's actual body, literally against her skin. This was not considered morbid. It was considered intimate, a continuation of physical closeness made portable, something to carry into a life in which the person himself was no longer present. The Victorians were, in this respect, considerably more direct about the physical reality of death than the culture that came after them. Half mourning, when it arrived, typically after 18 months to 2 years for a widow, introduced colour, but only 4 colours: grey, mauve, lavender and white. The list was exact, and not approximate. A widow appearing in pale blue was not observing half mourning. A widow appearing in blush pink was not. A widow appearing in any other shade, however clearly intended as a gentle transition, was making a legible error, and the women around her would read it as one. The precision of the list served a social function beyond mere regulation. It meant that any observer could place a widow in her mourning timeline without asking. Grey was the most conservative half-mourning choice, the shade closest to black in its refusal to announce anything. Mauve was the most assertive. The aniline dye Mauvine had been accidentally discovered by William Perkin in 1856 and had swept through fashionable dress in the years that followed. A widow choosing mauve for her first half-mourning gown was making, in the restrained visual language of the system, a visible decision about the kind of woman she intended to become. A widow choosing the palest grey was making a different decision, equally visible, equally read. The mourning timetable scaled precisely with the closeness of the loss. A widow occupied the longest and most rigorous position in the system. A mother mourning a child followed. Approximately 9 to 12 months of full mourning, reflecting a loss the period recognized as occupying its own particular depth. A daughter mourning a parent observed 6 to 12 months. A sibling observed 3 to 6 months. A first cousin observed 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the closeness of the relationship. More distant relatives observed weeks, at the family's discretion. The timetable also had to account for the complication of overlapping losses, a death that occurred while the household was already in mourning for another. In such cases, the household reverted to whichever stage of mourning was the deeper. A woman in second mourning for her father who then lost her husband returned immediately to full first mourning for the widow's period. The clock in effect restarted. The crape came back. This was considered the correct response, and the correct response in the Victorian mourning system was never easy. Getting the timetable wrong was always interpreted as a statement of character. A widow seen in second mourning dress before the expected period was a widow read as calculating or as indifferent, or, the most damaging reading, as having privately felt relieved. A widow still in full crape 18 months in, when the neighbourhood had already moved on, was read as either genuinely devoted or carefully theatrical. The assessment depended entirely on what the observers had already concluded about the marriage. The timetable was designed to be an objective measure. In practice, it was a lens, and the people looking through it had usually already made up their minds. The full first mourning costume weighed more than ordinary dress. Crape was heavier than silk. The veil added its own substantial length and movement. The multiple black petticoats required beneath a mid-Victorian skirt added further weight still. A widow dressed for a formal church service or a condolence call carried considerably more fabric than she wore in ordinary life, and she carried all of it in black, a colour that absorbed heat rather than reflecting it. In the warmest months, the full mourning costume was a form of sustained physical demand. Crape did not breathe as a lighter summer fabric would. The colour absorbed the day's radiant heat. The additional layers trapped warmth beneath the skirt in a way that made a morning of summer visits genuinely taxing. The widow moved through these obligations without complaint, because complaint about the physical experience of mourning did not fit the available vocabulary of the period. The sound of crape in motion was distinct from every other fabric. It did not have the musical swish of taffeta or the deeper sweep of heavy brocade. It produced a dry, persistent rustling, a vapory sound generated by the crimped weave, that announced the widow a moment before she appeared. Moving through a drawing room, she arrived orally before she arrived visually. In close and warm rooms, particularly in summer, the fabric carried its own faint particular scent. the specific combination of treated silk and mineral dye, and slight humidity that had no equivalent in any other cloth. The mourning house had a sound. The widow herself had a sound. She wore both everywhere she went for months without setting either down. The costume was the visible and audible language of Victorian grief, and it was expensive to speak fluently. Someone had to supply it, had to stock it, store it, and make it available at the precise and terrible moment when it was most urgently required. Behind every correctly dressed widow was a supply chain. Behind that supply chain was a commercial infrastructure of considerable sophistication, and at the centre of that infrastructure, at least in London, there was one address that the mourning industry had made famous long before Victoria had made grief famous herself. The address was 247 Regent Street. The full name was Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse, a title that made no attempt at euphemism, and in this particular business, euphemism would have been a professional failure. Jay's was exactly what it said it was, a single dedicated establishment supplying everything a correctly mourning household required. It had opened in 1841, 20 years before Queen Victoria entered the public mourning that would define her image for the remainder of her long life. This suggests that the founder understood the commercial possibilities of Victorian grief before Victoria herself had provided the most prominent possible advertisement for them. The location was not accidental. Regent Street was, by the mid-Victorian period, London's primary shopping address for households of consequence, the street where purchases of quality and purpose were made, where the establishments were large, the stock was comprehensive, and the service was professional. To place a mourning warehouse on Regent Street was to announce, in the grammar of London commerce, that the mourning business was a serious one, that it belonged alongside the drapers and the glove makers and the silk mercers as a legitimate part of the city's commercial life. That grief had an address worthy of its weight. Jay's occupied substantial premises across several floors. The ground floor was given over to the fabric departments. Yard after yard of black crape in graded widths, black bombazine, black parramatta, black cashmere, black plain silk. These were organised not by manufacturer but by mourning stage. A widow entering for the first time could move through the room in the order that her timetable would eventually follow. The crapes of deepest first mourning first, then the bombazines of established first mourning, then the lighter fabrics of second mourning, and at the furthest end of the floor, the grey and lavender and muted mauve of half mourning, available when the time eventually came. The room was a calendar made of cloth. Above the fabric floor were the made-up mourning gowns, complete garments in graduated stages of mourning dress, constructed in advance and available for fitting, alteration, or immediate purchase. The bonnet room was separately organised. The veil department was separately staffed, because a widow's veil was not a standard article and required its own process of measurement and careful construction. The floor above that held the accessories: gloves, boots, black-edged handkerchiefs, black stationery in grades of border width, black sealing wax and black mourning cards for the silver visiting card tray that sat in every respectable entrance hall. And beyond the accessories, the domestic mourning goods, the Holland cloths for covering furniture, the crape for draping banisters and picture frames, the specific materials for the shut-up rooms, the blinds, the covering cloths, the black bordered items required for a household to declare itself visibly and completely in mourning. Everything in the building was the same colour. This was what distinguished Jay's from every other retail establishment on Regent Street, and from nearly any other shop in London. There was no possibility of wandering into the wrong room and encountering something cheerful. Jay's was entirely, exclusively, and without apology, black. The founder's insight, and it was a genuine commercial insight, however detached from sentiment it was in its execution, was that grief created demand at exactly the moment when the grieving person was least equipped to navigate a complicated purchasing process. A newly bereaved widow in the first hours and days after her husband's death needed everything at once: the dress, the veil, the accessories, the household materials, the stationery. She needed all of it, urgently. She needed all of it correctly. The wrong fabric at the wrong stage, or a border that was too narrow too early, was not a private error. It was a public one, worn in the street, received by callers, observed by neighbours. There was a cost to getting it wrong that extended far beyond the price of the replacement garment. To provide everything from one address, at a guaranteed standard, with rapid service, was to offer something of genuine value at a moment of genuine vulnerability. Jay's did not require the widow to visit a draper for the fabric, a dressmaker for the gown, a hatter for the bonnet, a stationer for the paper, and a separate supplier for the domestic goods. Jay's made one visit sufficient. Whether this was charitable entrepreneurship or highly sophisticated commerce conducted in close proximity to grief was a question Jay's characteristically did not address. It simply opened its doors, stocked its shelves, and trained its staff. A widow who came to Jay's in the first days of bereavement came typically by carriage, and typically not alone. A female companion, a mother, a sister, a close friend who had herself been through the process and understood the system, was the expected arrangement. The widow in deepest first mourning was not expected to conduct commercial negotiations without support. The social conventions of the period did not consider it appropriate for a woman in fresh grief to manage a purchasing transaction entirely by herself, particularly one as consequential as this. The carriage stopped at the Regent Street frontage. The exterior of Jay's presented itself in a manner distinct from the rest of the street. There were no seasonal decorations, no cheerfully dressed windows, no lamps burning in the manner designed to attract the attention of the casual passer-by. The facade was quiet, dark, and composed, the commercial equivalent of the lowered blinds on the windows of a house in mourning. It announced in the visual grammar of the street that a specific and serious purpose was conducted inside, and that the people inside understood the nature of that purpose thoroughly. The interior was hushed. The noise of ordinary commerce, the calling of prices, the movement of a busy shop floor, the particular energy of a retail space designed to stimulate and encourage, was absent. Jay's interior operated closer to the atmosphere of a professional office than a shop. The floors were covered to reduce sound. The assistants moved without hurry and spoke in measured tones. The widow was seated, not directed to a counter to stand and negotiate, but placed in a chair and attended to. Fabric samples were brought to her rather than requiring her to move through the room in search of them. The transaction took place around her, rather than requiring her to navigate it herself. The feel of those samples was its own kind of information. The assistant placed the crape in the widow's hands first, the fabric she already knew or would shortly come to know, and then the bombazine beside it, and then the parramatta, each fabric communicating through its weight, and weave something about what it meant to wear it, and for how long. A woman who had never navigated the mourning system before could, through this process, come to understand the stages not as an abstract timetable, but as a physical sequence. The stages were not only dates on a calendar, There were different fabrics against the skin, a progression the body would know before the mind had fully registered it. This approach required training of a specific kind. The assistants at Jay's were expected to understand the mourning system in its technical entirety. Every stage, every fabric appropriate to each stage, every accessory correct or incorrect at any given moment in the widow's calendar. They were expected to read, from the dress a widow wore when she arrived, approximately where she was in her mourning period, and to calibrate their recommendations accordingly. They did not suggest second mourning fabrics to a woman still in first mourning. They did not raise the question of half mourning to a widow who'd not yet mentioned it. They followed the widow's timetable with care and did not attempt to advance it on her behalf. They were also trained in a particular quality of attentive restraint. The customer they served had arrived from a household in recent crisis. The professional requirement was to provide assistance without intrusion, useful expertise without unwanted opinions, sympathy without the performance of sentiment that would have felt, to most Victorian women of any standing, presumptuous. The sale was conducted. The widow left with what she needed. The exchange took place in a register that was professional on one side and practical on the other, and this combination, careful, expert, and discreet, was precisely what both parties required. Not every widow found this kind of service easy to accept. A woman who had managed her household's finances and commercial relationships for years, and who was perfectly capable of selecting her own bombazine, might find the institutional solicitousness of Jay's a mild trial. But she was, like Victorian widows generally, very polite about things that were useful, and Jay's was useful in a way that few other establishments could match. The most operationally remarkable aspect of the service, the aspect most consistently noted by those who used it, was the speed of urgent orders. An order placed in the morning could be fulfilled the same afternoon. An order placed on one day could be delivered the next. This was not a standard capability for a Victorian retail establishment of any kind. It required dressmakers working on the premises, a system for prioritizing urgent requests, and a standing stock of pre-cut and partially assembled garments that could be completed and fitted rapidly when the moment arose. In practice, this meant that a widow who sent a message to Jay's on the morning of her husband's death could receive a complete first morning wardrobe, gown, bonnet, veil, gloves, and the primary accessories, before the first formal condolence callers arrived that same afternoon. The mourning system required the widow to be correctly dressed from the moment she received visitors. Jay's had made this possible at the worst possible moment. Whether the rapid service constituted a genuine form of care for the bereaved, or a very precise commercial understanding of the moment at which a grieving woman was most likely to spend without negotiating the price, was a question the business left tactfully unresolved. Jay's was not the only establishment in this trade. The mourning market in London was substantial enough to sustain several large specialist operations within a short distance of each other. Peter Robinson's, also on Regent Street, served the same clientele and had acquired the informal public nickname Black Peter Robinson's, a designation that reveals something about the particular dark register in which Victorian London named its commercial institutions, and which was certainly not the name the management employed in their own correspondence. Avery's was another name in the trade. At the lower end of the market, ordinary drapers and haberdashers stocked mourning goods alongside their general inventory, serving households for whom a dedicated mourning warehouse was either unnecessary in scale or beyond what the household budget would support. The economic weight of the mourning industry taken as a whole was considerable. A widow's wardrobe, renewed and adjusted across the full 2-year period, moving from first mourning through second mourning and half mourning before the return to ordinary dress, represented a sustained and significant household expenditure. the domestic mourning goods added to the total. The stationery requirement, maintained across the same full period, added more. The funeral arrangements that had preceded everything, which were themselves governed by elaborate conventions about correct expenditure at each social level, added more still. Across the complete mourning period, a middle-class household could spend an amount comparable to several months of its ordinary income, and the industry had been designed at every level of the market to receive that expenditure gracefully. The mourning warehouse system reflected something specific about Victorian commercial culture, its capacity to identify a social requirement, build a comprehensive infrastructure around it, and present that infrastructure as a form of service. Jays did not create the mourning system. The mourning system existed long before Jays. But Jays organised it, concentrated it, and made it reliable at exactly the moment when reliability was most needed and most valued. This was the particular commercial accomplishment of the establishment. Not invention, but precision. The world that sustained Jays began to change before Jays closed. In the later Victorian period, medical voices had begun to question whether the physical demands of deep mourning dress were compatible with the health of the women wearing them. The weight, the heat, the restricted movement. These concerns appeared in professional journals with increasing frequency as the century progressed. Social commentary had also begun to note with increasing plainness the asymmetry at the heart of the system. A widower's mourning was measured in weeks. A widow's was measured in years. The system did not attempt to explain this, because the system generally did not consider itself obliged to explain anything. The First World War changed the calculation in a way no etiquette book had anticipated. When the scale of death was such that nearly every household in Britain was simultaneously managing a loss, sometimes more than one, sometimes several losses within a single family in a single year, the elaborate machinery of individual Victorian mourning became practically impossible to sustain. There were not enough workrooms to produce the crape at the scale the losses required. There were not enough seamstresses to make the gowns, and there was not, more precisely, any remaining social permission to mark one death with the elaborate and extended observance the Victorian system required, when every house on both sides of the street was managing its own version of exactly the same loss. Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse closed in the early years of the 20th century. The premises on Regent Street became something else. The dark and hushed floors were repurposed. The fabric departments, the bonnet rooms, the veil department, the domestic goods section. All of it went. What remained was the street, unchanged in its geography, and the shoppers, changed considerably in their expectations, moving through a city that had decided by degrees and then all at once to grieve differently. The dress, and the shop that supplied it, were the visible surface of the widow's first year. But the system extended into every part of her daily life, beyond what she wore when she left the house. It governed who she was permitted to see, and when, and whether her door was open or closed to a visitor on a given afternoon. It governed the silver tray in the entrance hall, what was placed on it, and what it communicated about her availability. The visiting cards on that tray were keeping a precise and public record, and reading them correctly required knowing a set of rules that were, in their own way, as exact as anything that had been supplied to her at 247 Regent Street. The silver tray sat in the entrance hall of every Victorian household of standing, a shallow ornamental object whose purpose was entirely social. It received visiting cards. This was not decorative. It was a system. The Victorian visiting card was a small printed rectangle, roughly the size of a modern playing card, sometimes slightly smaller. carrying the caller's name in engraved type. The etiquette governing these cards was precise in a way that modern social customs rarely approach. The card communicated information before any word was spoken, the manner in which it was left, the condition in which it arrived, the particular fold that might appear at one corner. Each detail had a conventional meaning in the social grammar of the period. Leaving a card was distinct from being received. Receiving a card was distinct from the caller having been admitted. The tray held the evidence of all of these distinctions, and a widow who understood the system could read from the accumulation in the dish the precise state of her social relationships at a glance. Her own visiting cards, the ones she would eventually use to call on others, now carried a black border. The width of that border was calibrated to the depth of her mourning. In deepest first mourning, the border was wide enough to leave a narrow white field in the centre for her printed name. As mourning progressed, the border narrowed in correspondence with the dress. Second mourning brought a thinner border. Half mourning brought a border barely visible at close range. A widow who received a card from another widow could read, from that border, how recently the death had occurred, and approximately how far through her mourning the sender had progressed. The stationery was doing a form of social labour before the widow had said a word or opened a door. The system was, if nothing else, extremely efficient about distributing information. The phrase "not at home" in Victorian social usage did not mean that the person was physically elsewhere. It meant she was not available to receive visitors. A widow could be sitting in the drawing room a few feet from the front door at the precise moment her servant delivered this message to the caller on the step outside. Both parties understood this arrangement. The caller understood that the mistress of the house was declining to receive. The convention, and this is the detail worth attending to, was that this understanding was not acknowledged. Not by the caller, who thanked the servant and left a card. Not by the servant, who accepted the card and closed the door. Not by the widow, who received the card later and made her own quiet note. Not at home was not, in Victorian social convention, considered a form of deception. It was considered managed availability, a mechanism by which a person could control the pace and character of her social encounters without the social cost of explicit refusal. For the widow in first mourning, this mechanism was not merely convenient, it was necessary. The number of condolence callers in the weeks following a death, neighbours, acquaintances, professional connections of her husband's, distant family members who felt the occasion required a personal appearance, could be considerable. The emotional cost of receiving each of them, maintaining composure through each conversation, navigating each carefully choreographed expression of sympathy, this cost was cumulative and real. Not at home gave the widow a degree of control over her own endurance. On the afternoons when she had nothing left, the tray collected the cards of the people who had called and found her unavailable, and she wrote to them later. The social restrictions of first mourning extended far beyond the drawing room. A widow in first mourning did not attend dinner parties. She did not attend the theatre, the opera, or any public concert. She did not attend balls or assemblies or any gathering where the purpose of the occasion was pleasure rather than duty. These restrictions were not guidelines. They were understood as obligations, and a widow who appeared at a dinner party 6 weeks into first mourning was not merely making a social error. She was making a statement about how she understood her own grief, and that statement would be interpreted, discussed, and remembered by everyone in the room. The restrictions had a specific duration and a specific geography. For the first 6 months, the period of deepest first mourning, no social going out was appropriate in any form. After that period, the edges softened slightly and in a specific sequence. Small private gatherings in the homes of the very closest connections became possible. A dinner of 4 or 5 intimate friends in a family member's house, quiet, purposeful, not designed around entertainment, might be acceptable late in first mourning if the widow was well enough and the friendship sufficiently close. A dinner of 20, at which guests were expected to be amusing and conversation was expected to be light, was not appropriate for a considerably longer time. The distinction between these two occasions was clear to everyone involved, and the widow was expected to be the person most precise about where the line fell. The morning call, despite its name, did not take place in the morning. It took place in the afternoon, typically between 2 and 4 o'clock, and was distinguished from an evening engagement by its duration, its informality, and its particular social expectations. The designation mourning was simply the term the period used to separate it from the evening, and no one alive inside the system found this confusing. The system explained itself only to itself, and this was considered entirely sufficient. A morning call lasted between 15 and 30 minutes by convention. Longer visits communicated closeness or genuine interest. Shorter visits communicated obligation discharged. A caller who stayed beyond the permitted period without the hostess's evident encouragement was committing a mild but recognizable social error, one the hostess would note and file without commenting. A caller who arrived, said the minimum required, and left before the tea things had been properly settled was making a different error of a different kind. Both kinds were read. Both were remembered. For the widow, the morning call was the primary structure of social contact in the months after the funeral. She received callers in the drawing room, which was dressed in mourning, which was quieter than it would otherwise have been, in which the flowers that might ordinarily have been arranged on the mantelpiece were absent, because flowers in a strictly observing first mourning household were not appropriate. The room announced its situation. The widow announced hers, and the callers came in the order that convention prescribed: close family first, then intimate friends, then the wider circle of respectable acquaintance, and at the outer edge the people who came because not coming would have been a noticed absence. The condolence call was one of the most precisely structured social occasions in Victorian life. Its precision was not accidental. An unstructured encounter between a caller who did not know what to say and a widow who had been managing her composure for days was uncomfortable for everyone and genuinely useful to no one. The choreography existed to protect both parties. The caller arrived. The caller was received. The caller acknowledged the death with language that moved through the required territory. The qualities of the deceased, the caller's own sense of loss, the hope that time would bring some measure of comfort. This was not a script in the literal sense, but the vocabulary was so established and the gestures so familiar that it functioned as one. The widow received these expressions with the face she had prepared for them, composed, quietly grateful, neither too severe nor too close to breaking. This face required considerable maintenance across repeated visits, and maintaining it was its own form of labour, invisible and unacknowledged and expected to be continuous. Some callers were more accomplished at this than others. A woman who had herself been widowed understood the choreography from the inside and navigated it without error. A man who had not been trained in the particular vocabulary of the condolence call sometimes said something well-intentioned and precisely wrong, something that required the widow to manage not only her own grief but also the caller's discomfort at having caused a moment neither of them had anticipated. The widow managed this too because the widow managed most things in the first year, and managing it gracefully was the expectation. What was not said was as precisely governed as what was. The caller did not ask detailed questions about the manner of death unless the widow introduced the subject herself. The caller did not ask about the estate, the will, the financial situation, or anything that might require the widow to confirm or deny information that was not yet settled. The caller did not introduce any topic that might require the widow to perform a grief more specific than the general, managed sorrow she was currently sustaining. The caller did not say anything truthful but unkind about the dead man. His death had removed his ability to respond, and the social convention was that this created a specific obligation on everyone in the room to speak of him well, at least until the funeral flowers had properly dried. After the caller left, the widow's name was added, mentally or in writing, to the caller's own social record. One had called, one had been received. The relationship in its mourning configuration was formally acknowledged. The next step would be the widow's acknowledgement, a card or a brief note sent within a day or two confirming that the call had been noted and appreciated. This correspondence was its own small task, multiplied by every caller who came, adding to the stack of duties the widow was managing alongside everything else. The black-bordered stationery the widow used for this correspondence had its own grammar. The border width had to match the mourning stage. In deepest first mourning, the border was wide enough to occupy a substantial portion of the writing surface, reducing the available space for the letter itself. This was a physical communication made before the letter was opened. The person receiving it understood, from the width of the black border on the envelope, something about when the death had occurred and how deeply the widow was observing the loss. By half mourning, the border was a thin line. The progression of the border tracked the mourning calendar, and a correspondent who kept the widow's letters could read, across a collection of them, the exact arc of her first year. The volume of correspondence a widow in a well-connected household was expected to manage was considerable. Condolence letters required individual handwritten acknowledgements. A printed form of response was not considered appropriate for personal correspondence at most social levels. A widow whose husband had been professionally prominent or socially well-connected might receive many dozens of condolence letters. Each required a response. Each response had to be written in the specific black-bordered hand the occasion required. This project could take weeks, conducted alongside every other obligation the first month imposed, and the convention was that it be completed without visible complaint and without the assistance of a professional secretary for anything addressed to a personal acquaintance. Church was one of the very few public spaces available to a widow in first mourning. The exceptions to the general restriction on leaving the house were narrow. The funeral itself, the Sunday service and relevant holy days, and practical necessities of a medical or legal character. Everything else was ruled out for the initial period. The widow attended church in full first mourning dress. She entered by the door appropriate to her family's pew. She sat where she had always sat. She did not linger in the porch after the service, did not stand in conversation in the churchyard, did not allow the occasion to become a social one in any form. She acknowledged what courtesy required and returned home. What the church service offered that the drawing room could not was a specific kind of continuity. The widow sat in the same pew she had shared with her husband on earlier Sundays. The same view, the same liturgy, the same light coming through the same windows at roughly the same angle as it had come through before. The physical space was unchanged. She was unchanged in her relationship to it as far as the building knew. Everything else had been reorganized around her. For the duration of the service, the requirement was only to be present, not to compose a face, not to receive and respond, not to manage anything. To sit in a familiar place and hear familiar words that were not addressed to her personally, but that were, in this particular hour of this particular Sunday, entirely for her. In a first year that made almost no allowance for ordinary quiet, this was not a small thing. The social restrictions did not lift all at once. They lifted in stages, roughly corresponding to the stages of the mourning wardrobe, and the two systems tracked each other closely enough that an observant woman watching another widow's dress could make accurate inferences about her social availability without asking. In the first 6 months, the widow received callers but made none. She attended church. She did not go out socially by any other means. After 6 months, she could begin making calls, limited to the closest connections, brief, quiet, and not in any setting that might read as entertainment or as a gesture toward the ordinary social world she had temporarily vacated. At the first anniversary, a second mourning began. The social world opened further. Evening gatherings in private homes became possible. Small dinners of an intimate kind were acceptable. The public entertainments, theatre, concerts, any gathering where the occasion was defined by pleasure, remained unavailable for longer. But the private world, the drawing rooms of the people who knew her well enough not to require anything she was not yet able to give, expanded in a way that was, after a year of careful management, genuinely noticeable. The widows who recorded this period in letters and diaries were generally specific about what the expansion felt like. Not that they were ready to be cheerful. That was rarely the word they used. But the isolation of first mourning had a weight that accumulated slowly over months, and when it was reduced, even by the modest permission of an intimate evening in a trusted friend's house, the change was felt clearly enough to be worth noting. The system had, for a year, determined when and how and to whom the widow was visible. At the end of that year, the terms were renegotiated, not dissolved but renegotiated, and she moved back toward the world by small and numbered degrees. While the social calendar was being managed, which visitors to receive, which afternoons to mark available, which correspondence to answer first, a parallel set of calculations was running in an entirely different part of the widow's life. These calculations had no calendar, no etiquette book, and no conventional timetable. They had figures on paper, a solicitor's notes, and decisions that would shape the next decade in ways that the correct mourning dress, however precisely chosen, could not address and could not help. The figures on paper had been her husband's domain. This was not usually stated as a formal rule. It was simply the arrangement that most Victorian middle-class households operated under, and it was so thoroughly understood on both sides that it rarely required articulation. The husband managed the money. The wife managed the household within the money. These were different things, different skills, different relationships with numbers, different vocabularies for describing what was happening and why. And on the day the solicitor laid the will and the account books on the table in front of her, the widow was introduced sometimes for the first time in her adult life to the money itself. The will had to go through probate. Probate was the legal process by which the court validated the will, confirmed the executor's authority to act, and authorized the administration of the estate. In the mid-Victorian period, this process took time. Weeks at minimum, several months if the estate was complex or if anything in the will was disputed. In the interim, the widow's financial access was constrained. The provisions existed in principle. The income was nominally available, but the actual mechanism for distributing money from the estate was suspended, while the court completed its process, which meant that a widow dealing simultaneously with the first weeks of grief was also managing a household on reduced financial certainty without the ability to take any formal action on the estate she had, legally already inherited. The reading of the will itself had a particular atmosphere. The solicitor read it aloud in full to the assembled relevant parties, the widow and the executors her husband had named, who were typically male and typically family connections or professional associates. The widow heard in formal legal language what her husband had decided her future would look like, the income provisions, the property arrangements, any specific bequests to other people, the appointment of trustees, and any conditions that attached to her entitlement. Some wills included clauses that altered the widow's share if she chose to remarry, a detail that the solicitor delivered in the same measured, professionally neutral tone as everything else in the document. The will was sometimes what the widow had expected. Sometimes it was not. Provisions that had been discussed or promised during the marriage had not always been formalized in writing. Property that had been described during the marriage as unencumbered turned out to carry a mortgage. Debts that had not been mentioned were recorded in the estate accounts. Bequests to other parties, a natural child the widow had not known about, a long-standing obligation to a dependent relative, could alter the picture considerably. The reading of the will was, for some widows, the moment at which the actual financial shape of their marriage became visible for the first time. What had been described in general, reassuring terms during the marriage, was now laid out in specific numbers, and the numbers were not always reassuring. The jointure was a specific legal instrument, a provision made for the wife at the time of the marriage settlement, intended to give her an income in the event of her husband's death. It typically took the form of an annuity charged against a specific property or a guaranteed income from a defined portion of the estate, agreed before the wedding and recorded in the formal settlement that the family's solicitors had negotiated on both sides. A jointure, when it existed and when it was properly funded, gave the widow something valuable, a predictable income from a known and protected source. It was not dependent on how the rest of the estate had performed. It was not affected by whether the husband had managed his investments well or borrowed more than he could repay. The jointure was hers, specifically reserved for this eventuality, arranged in advance by people who understood that the eventuality would one day arrive. Not every marriage produced a jointure. Formal marriage settlements were primarily a feature of marriages where both families had property to negotiate, where the bride's family wished to secure her provision and had the standing to insist on it. A widow whose husband had been a professional man of no particular inherited wealth, a solicitor, a surgeon, a clergyman, a merchant who had built his position from income rather than inheritance, might find that no jointure existed. Her income in widowhood came from whatever the will had provided, which might be adequate, or might be modest, or might be severely complicated by debt. For many Victorian wives, the household accounts represented the practical limit of their financial knowledge during the marriage. They knew how much the cook cost. They knew the coal bill, the linen bill, the quarterly tradesman's accounts that arrived at the back door. They managed the domestic economy with care and considerable skill, within the budget their husbands had allocated for the purpose. What they frequently did not know was the larger financial picture. The income from investments, the rents from any property, the state of any loans, the overall balance between what was coming in and what was going out, at a level above the household's running expenses. This was not considered unusual or inadequate. Managing a Victorian middle-class household was a genuine management task. Maintaining staff, provisioning a table that received regular visitors, clothing the family appropriately, sustaining the social correspondence and seasonal obligations that the household's position required. That this management was separated by convention and by practice from the broader financial structure of the family's affairs was simply the arrangement. It worked, more or less, as long as the husband was alive to manage the parts the wife had not been given access to. When the solicitor opened the estate accounts before her, the widow encountered what she had not previously been expected to understand. The numbers in front of her were not the household bills she had authorized. They were the underlying structure of the financial life that had been running, separately throughout the marriage. Some of what she found confirmed what she had generally assumed. Some of it did not, and some of it required a vocabulary she had not yet learned, about instruments and holdings she had not previously needed to know the names of. Debt was the complication that could change the character of the disclosure entirely. In a household that had been living within its income, encountering the accounts was a process of orientation, unfamiliar, requiring attention, but stable underneath. In a household that had not been living within its income, the discovery was something else. English law gave the husband's creditors a specific claim on the estate. If the estate was solvent, if the assets exceeded the debts after all claims were tallied, the creditors were paid first, and the widow received whatever remained of her provisions after that settlement. If the estate was insolvent, the situation became considerably more complex and potentially more damaging. The widow did not personally inherit the debt in the sense of becoming liable for it from her own resources, but she might find that the provisions made for her in the will could not be fully honoured once the creditors had been satisfied. Debt was not uncommon in Victorian middle-class households. The cost of maintaining the correct appearance, the right house, the right number of servants, the correct wardrobe, the table that received guests with appropriate generosity, consistently absorbed the income of many professional families and sometimes exceeded it. Some men borrowed, intending to repay at a future point. Some invested in things that lost value. Some simply spent at a pace slightly faster than the income supported, in a gradual and quiet way that created no visible crisis, until the crisis became unavoidable. The widow who discovered unexpected debt in the first weeks of bereavement was managing several things simultaneously: the mourning dress, the condolence calls, the correspondence, the face she maintained for the visitors, and underneath all of it, the growing recognition that the financial world she had understood herself to inhabit was not precisely the financial world that had actually existed. The marriage had been conducted in one set of conditions. The death had revealed another. Pin money was the allowance a wife received during marriage for her personal expenses, her clothing, her small gifts, her stationery, the particular purchases of daily life that were hers to manage independently. It arrived regularly, on a known schedule, without requiring her to negotiate for it. It was, in the practical experience of the marriage, the money that was most simply and reliably hers. It stopped when the husband died. What replaced it was not a direct substitute. The income from the estate, the jointure or the interest on investments or the rents from property, was now the widow's income, but it arrived through the estate's mechanisms and often through the trustees' decisions about distribution. The regular, unconditional, personal allowance was gone. In its place was something more complex, more subject to process, and, in the first weeks, while probate was still running, and the trustees were still establishing their working relationship with the widow, potentially less immediately accessible. Some widows found the transition to managing money in its full form surprisingly straightforward. They had been managing complexity for years. The household they had run was a complex logistical and financial enterprise, and the competence they had developed in managing it transferred, with some adjustment, to the larger set of figures they now controlled. A woman who could balance the household accounts, negotiate with tradespeople, manage a staff of servants, and sustain a social correspondence of dozens of correspondents, could, it turned out, also learn to read a trust deed. Others found the transition disorienting in ways they had not anticipated. The vocabulary was different. The instruments were different. A bank account in her own name, something she had not previously had a physical and administrative reality that was its own form of novelty. The solicitor's letters assumed a familiarity with financial language that she had not needed before and had not been expected to acquire. The widow now received correspondence from a range of new and unfamiliar parties, from trustees, from bank managers, from the tenants of any inherited property, from investment managers, from brokers handling stock or bond holdings. Each of these correspondents operated in a register of technical language that the widow was now expected to understand and respond to: probate valuations, trust instruments, annuity schedules, mortgage deeds, rent arrears, letters of administration. Some widows relied on male relatives or hired agents to translate these materials and to manage the practical interactions they involved. This was conventional, expected, and widely considered appropriate. The trustee and executor structure in most Victorian wills was designed, in part, to provide exactly this kind of professional intermediary. The question of whether the intermediary was any good was a separate one, and the answer varied. Some widows engaged directly with the financial vocabulary and found that it was learnable. The learning was private. The social conventions of the period did not provide an obvious space in which a widow could acknowledge that she had spent the previous month teaching herself the difference between a consolidated annuity and a mortgage-backed bond. But the learning happened, and the widows who undertook it generally found that the material, while unfamiliar, was not beyond understanding. Several discovered that they had a clearer instinct for financial management than their husbands had possessed, which was a realization the drawing room did not provide an obvious occasion to share. Life insurance had become increasingly available during the Victorian period. The large mutual assurance societies, some of them well-established institutions by the mid-Victorian era, offered policies that, if maintained across the years of a marriage, would provide a lump sum or an ongoing income at the husband's death. Whether such a policy existed was something the widow might or might not have known about in any detail while her husband was alive. The discovery of a life insurance policy in the estate papers was, for some widows, the financial revelation of the first weeks, a provision she had not known about, or had known about only in the most general terms, that turned out to make a material difference to the next several years. The discovery that no such policy existed, in a household where the widow had assumed one did, based on conversation she'd understood at the time as being more specific than they turned out to be, was, equally, a revelation of a different kind. The widow was legally femi sole. The law gave her the right to enter contracts, to own property, to accumulate savings, to invest, to make decisions about her own affairs without requiring another person's formal consent. These were powers she had not had on the day before her husband died. What had not always changed with equal completeness was the practical framework. A will that appointed male trustees to manage the estate on her behalf. The standard arrangement in the majority of Victorian wills meant that her legal freedom was filtered, in practice, through the trustees' agreement. She could not sell property without their consent. She could not redirect investment income without their approval. She could not make a major financial decision without presenting the case to the men her husband had selected to oversee his arrangements. These men were chosen before she was widowed, on terms that had nothing to do with what she might want or need from them. This arrangement was understood by most parties who thought about it as protection. A widow newly entering the management of a complete financial picture for the first time was, in this view, best served by the guidance of experienced men who could provide continuity and expertise. Whether the widow found this view accurate depended largely on the quality of the men. A trustee who was competent, attentive, and genuinely concerned with her welfare was an asset of real value. A trustee who was inattentive, conflicted, or simply not particularly interested was a source of delay and friction that was difficult to address without a level of confrontation that the widow's social position, dependent on being seen as appropriately managed and composed, made it difficult to initiate. The money, in the end, was the hinge that connected everything else. How much there was shaped what the first year looked like in its practical reality, and what the years after that would look like. It shaped whether the house could be kept, whether the staff could be retained, whether the children could remain in their schools, whether the social position that required a specific and ongoing expenditure to sustain could be maintained or had to be revised, quietly and without announcement, in ways the neighbours would eventually notice. And it shaped, with a directness that all other parts of the mourning system avoided, the question that was already forming in the minds of everyone who knew her situation, the question the drawing room managed in one register, and the account books managed in another entirely: what would happen next? The timetable of the mourning dress would end. The social restrictions would lift in their staged and measured way. The correspondence would eventually be completed, and the widow would arrive at some point in the first year or shortly after it, at a question that the etiquette books did not answer, and that the callers in her drawing-room raised only obliquely, if at all. The question of whether she would marry again, and if so, when and under what terms, and what the people around her had already decided her answer ought to be. The remarriage question was rarely asked directly. This was a matter of social delicacy. Asking a widow in her first year whether she intended to marry again was, in most drawing-room contexts, considered premature, and in the first months, almost indecent. The question was raised in other ways. A reference, apparently casual, to the widow's still being young. An observation about how much her children needed a steadying male presence in the household. An expression of hope from a female relative of a certain degree of forwardness that she would not spend her remaining years in solitude. These were not, in the grammar of Victorian social conversation, questions. They were something more like nudges, offered in a register that allowed the person doing the nudging to claim, afterward, that they had said nothing of the kind. The widow received these nudges with the expression she had developed for receiving things she had not invited. She had been practicing this expression for several months, and by this point she was quite good at it. The etiquette of remarriage had its own calendar, separate from but related to the mourning timetable. A widow who remarried before her full mourning period was concluded was not making an error that could be addressed directly. Marriage was a legal act, sanctioned by the Church, not subject to the same explicit conventions as the depth of crape trimming on a gown. But she was making a statement that everyone around her would interpret, and the interpretation was rarely flattering. 2 years was the generally understood minimum before a widow's remarriage could proceed without significant comment from the people who noticed these things, and in certain households and certain circles, The expectation was considerably longer than that. The widow who remarried at 14 months was read as having moved on too quickly, as having been, perhaps, not quite as devastated as a correct wife would have been. The widow who remarried at 4 years was read as either genuinely devoted to her first husband's memory, or, depending on the circumstances and the second husband's particular qualities, as having finally been unable to resist an arrangement she had clearly been considering for some time. The widow who remained unmarried at 7 years was read as admirably devoted, or, if she seemed to be managing rather too well, as possibly not having required a second husband in the way the system assumed she should. Every position on the timeline attracted its own interpretation. No position was neutral. The timetable itself had no formal authority. It was not published. It was not enforced by any institution. It existed purely in the social reckoning of the people who observed it, which meant it was enforced by everyone and everywhere, continuously, with no possibility of appeal. Behind the timetable stood the most prominent widow in the country. Queen Victoria had entered her widowhood in December 1861, on the death of Prince Albert, and had not re-entered any public life that looked like ordinary social engagement for years afterward. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She kept his shaving water brought to his rooms every morning long after he was gone. She was, in this respect, the most visible possible advertisement for a particular model of widowhood, permanent, complete, and expressed in every detail of daily life. Ordinary Victorian widows were not expected to achieve this standard, but the standard existed. It was visible, and the widow, who lightened her mourning at a pace that felt to the people around her slightly quicker than was necessary, was implicitly measured against an example she had not been consulted about and could not escape. The widower did not face the same calendar. A man who had lost his wife could remarry within a year, within 6 months in some cases, without the kind of social consequence that would attach to a widow making the identical decision on the identical timetable. The asymmetry was not considered a contradiction by the period that operated it. It was considered a reflection of different needs. The widower needed a mother for his children. He needed someone to manage the household. He needed, in short, a wife, and the social understanding was that this was a practical necessity that could not reasonably be delayed for 2 years, while the household organized itself around an absence. The widow's needs were not framed in equivalent terms. A widow who needed income, or who needed help managing the estate, or whose children needed a father. These needs were real, and were sometimes acknowledged privately in the practical register of solicitors' offices and family consultations. But the social framing of the widow situation did not foreground need in the way that the widower's situation routinely did. The widow was expected to manage. The widower was expected to need. This distinction was not stated anywhere explicitly. It was simply assumed, and the assumption shaped the social permission granted to each. The widower who remarried within the year was described by the people who discussed him in drawing rooms as having been sensible about a difficult situation. The widow who remarried within the year was described as having been, and the vocabulary shaded at this point, depending on the speaker's degree of charity, hasty or understandably lonely, or perhaps somewhat calculating. The calculation in question was rarely specified. It did not need to be. The word was sufficient, and the people who used it understood exactly what was meant. The double standard had practical consequences beyond the social commentary. A widower who needed to remarry quickly could do so without the extended costume requirements, that a second marriage after a short interval would impose on the widow. A widow who remarried before the end of first mourning would need to navigate a transition between mourning dress and wedding dress, that the etiquette of the period had not provided a clean procedure for because the etiquette of the period had not anticipated that a widow would wish to make this transition quickly. The social world communicated its assumptions in every direction simultaneously, including through the gaps in what it had thought to plan for. For some widows, the question of remarriage was not primarily a social one. It was a financial one, and the financial aspect was real enough that the romantic framing the period preferred was sometimes difficult to sustain in the face of the account books. A widow whose jointure was modest, whose husband had left debts that reduced the estate substantially, or who was managing a household with children on an income that the accounts had made clear was insufficient. This widow faced a calculation that was specific and pressing. The Victorian period did not provide many respectable routes to significant earned income for a woman of the middle classes. The options available, taking in boarders at the extreme end, working as a governess or schoolmistress at a somewhat less extreme end, both involved a visible reduction in social standing. And social standing was itself a practical resource in a world where one's ability to access useful connections, to be invited to the gatherings at which introductions were made, to be considered a suitable party for the kinds of arrangements the period described as social and meant as partly economic. All of this depended on maintaining an appearance that was expensive. A widow who descended visibly into financial difficulty was a widow whose social position became more precarious at exactly the moment when social position was most expensive to maintain. Remarriage, to a man whose income was adequate, resolved this problem efficiently. It resolved it in a way the period understood and accepted, in a way that required very little explanation or justification, and the understanding and acceptance made the financial motivation considerably easier to absorb into the approved social narrative of a widow who had found comfort and companionship after her loss. The pressure toward remarriage was not applied directly in polite company. Victorian social conventions did not allow for frank discussion of such matters in the drawing room, and a widow managing her first year with any composure was unlikely to receive a blunt suggestion from a neighbour. The pressure arrived in other forms. It arrived in the form of a well-meaning female relative who mentioned, without appearing to intend anything by it, that a particular mutual acquaintance had married again and was managing very well. The husband was a good sort, the children had settled, the house was rather better situated than the previous one. It arrived in the form of a family solicitor who observed, during a review of the estate accounts, that the income might be more simply managed if the household were reduced, a suggestion that, in context, had a clear implication. It arrived in the form of the widow's own awareness that she was young, or relatively young, and that the particular freedoms of her current situation were freedoms that the world around her did not generally believe a woman should need or expect to retain indefinitely. Some wills contained a specific clause that altered the widow's financial provision if she chose to remarry. The conditions varied by will. In some cases, the entire income provision ceased on remarriage and passed to the children or to trustees for their benefit. In others, the reduction was partial. She retained a portion but lost the use of the house, or the control of investment holdings that had produced the larger part of her income. In still others, the clause operated only if she remarried within a defined period, after which the provision was restored regardless. The effect of such a clause on the widow's practical reasoning was substantial. A widow with a comfortable income from the estate, and a will that would remove that income on remarriage, had a specific financial reason to assess any second marriage with great care. The man proposing would need to provide an income at least equivalent to what she was giving up. This income would need to be assessed and confirmed in advance, through the solicitor-to-solicitor exchange that the period's marriage negotiations produced. This assessment was not something that could be discussed openly in the social language of the period. It happened nonetheless, and it was thorough. The legal consequence of remarriage was one of the most specifically striking facts about the Victorian widow's position, and the period did not spend a great deal of time drawing attention to it. If a widow remarried, she became feme covert again. The legal independence she had acquired on the day of her first husband's death, the right to own property, to enter contracts, to accumulate savings, to make decisions without another person's formal consent, would pass to her new husband. His legal personhood would, again, subsume hers. The property she had managed and sometimes improved across the years of her widowhood, the house, the investments, the savings she had accumulated, would become his property under the law as it stood before 1882. She would re-enter the legal condition she had spent her first marriage in, from the first morning of the second. This was the law, and it was generally known. What is striking is how rarely it was foregrounded in the social discussion of widow remarriage. The conversation focused on sentiment, propriety, the welfare of the children, the question of whether the memory of the first husband was being honoured adequately. The legal question that marriage was a transaction with specific consequences for her rights as a person occupied a register that most social conversation of the period did not reach, and was not particularly encouraged to reach. Some widows knew this and calculated accordingly. Some widows knew it and remarried anyway. Some widows did not know it in adequate detail until the second marriage was underway, and the second husband was managing what had been hers, and some widows, a significant and not often sufficiently acknowledged number, used this knowledge as one item among several in the ledger that persuaded them the current arrangement was preferable to what remarriage would produce. Most Victorian widows of the middle and upper classes did not remarry. The remarriage rate for widows was lower than for widowers, lower than it had been in earlier centuries, and it declined further as the Victorian period progressed. The reasons given in letters and diaries were varied, and the space between the stated reason and the actual reason was, in many cases, the most interesting part. Some cited devotion to the first husband's memory, a reason the period valued, celebrated and exemplified in the 40 years of Queen Victoria's own extended widowhood. Some cited the children, whose welfare was best served by not introducing a new and untested authority into the household. Some cited the observation that they had not met anyone whose qualities were comparable to those of the man they had lost, which was either a genuine assessment or a formula that the conventions of the period made available for use when the real answer was more complicated. Some widows, in their private correspondence, in the letters and diaries that the convention of female reticence did not entirely suppress, noted that the freedom of the current arrangement had turned out to be valuable in ways they had not anticipated. The management of their own affairs, the legal standing, the particular quality of a daily life organized around their own judgment rather than another person's, the discovery that they were capable of things the marriage had not required them to be capable of, and that this discovery had changed something in their understanding of themselves. These observations were not offered in drawing rooms, but they appear in the private record with enough consistency to suggest that the experience was not rare. The mourning system had been designed to manage a transition, to move a woman from the status of wife through the managed stages of grief and deposit her, at the conclusion of the process, at a point from which she could resume a social existence that resembled the one she'd known before. The dress would change stage by stage. The social restrictions would lift in their numbered sequence. The account books would become familiar. The solicitor's visits would become routine. The question would be asked in drawing rooms in one form or another, and the widow would give her answer. The answer for a great many Victorian widows was that they were staying, that the life the first year had produced, quietly, under the weight of all that the year had required, was the life they intended to continue. That the system had put them through the correct forms and delivered them to the correct destination, and the destination, it turned out, was here, in the house that was now theirs, managing the affairs that were now theirs, sitting in the drawing room that was now theirs, with the stationary border narrowed and the crape softened, and the circle of the drawing room a little wider, thinking about what the second year would make possible that the first year had only begun to show. The year had made something, not only taken, though the taking was real and continuous, and was felt in the specific way that sustained removal is felt, differently from sudden loss, longer and quieter and harder to name at any given moment, but made. Something particular to this experience, something the women who were going through it would not have said at the beginning that they expected to emerge carrying. The children of the household had been in mourning too. This was not a detail the system overlooked. Children in a Victorian household in mourning were required to observe the dress, smaller versions of the same black, the same crape, the same appropriate fabrics calibrated to their ages and their relationship to the deceased. A child who had lost a father wore first mourning dress. The dress was adjusted to the child's proportions and constructed from the same materials as the adult version, and observed for the same duration. Small children in miniature crape bonnets and small black coats moved through the first year of the widow's household alongside her, their dress announcing in the same visual grammar as hers the status of the household they had come from. What this meant for the widow was an additional layer of management on top of an already considerable stack. She was managing her own grief. She was managing the social requirements imposed by the system. She was managing the finances, the solicitor, the correspondence, the drawing room, the visitors who required composure from her that she was simultaneously required not to expend herself on. And she was managing the children's experience of the same loss, in a household that was physically organized around its own grief, where the covered mirrors and the draped furniture and the drawn curtains communicated loss to anyone who walked through the rooms. The children lived in this house. The widow managed them in it. The etiquette books were comprehensive about visiting card dimensions and crape border widths, and had virtually nothing to say about the conversation a mother conducted with an 8-year-old at bedtime, in a room where the curtains were edged in black. The house itself had changed in ways that went beyond what had been imposed. A house lived in by one adult instead of two, organizing itself around a single person's decisions and requirements, acquired a different character over time. The furniture shifted by increments toward her habits. The rooms most used were the rooms she used. The rooms least used were the rooms that had been his particular territory. The study, perhaps, or wherever he had read in the evenings. And these rooms had a quality of quiet that was not only the quietness of an unused room, it was more specific than that. By the end of the first year, some of the covered surfaces had been uncovered. The mirrors draped at the beginning of the morning could be gradually restored. The clocks could be restarted. The blinds on the street-facing windows, drawn fully in the first days, had been partially raised long before the anniversary. The practical management of the house required light, and the mourning period understood that total darkness was an ideal sustained in letter rather than entirely in practice. The house at 12 months looked different from the house at 1 month. The widow who moved through it was differently familiar with both versions. She knew where the account books were and where the solicitor's letters were filed. and which of the servants could be trusted with which kinds of information. She had learned the house as a thing she was managing, rather than as a house she was living in, alongside someone else who was managing it with her. The private record of the first year, the letters, the diaries, the journal fragments that the conventions of Victorian public life did not suppress entirely, is a remarkable body of material. Remarkable partly for what it contains, and partly for the consistent and significant gap between what it contains and what the same women were saying, in the same period, in the drawing room. In the drawing room, the widow was managing. She was composed. She was grateful for the calls. She was doing what was required and doing it correctly. In the letters written to trusted correspondents, sisters, the closest friends, the female connections who could be relied upon to receive more than the approved surface, a different set of sentences appeared. The specific quality of the early mornings, before the household woke, the weight of Sunday evenings, which had been shared time and were now entirely hers in a way she'd not asked for, the experience of beginning a sentence with "we" and correcting it, mid-sentence, to something else, in front of people who had noticed. These were not things the drawing room provided a vocabulary for. The letters provided one. Some widows described in these private letters an experience they found difficult to share even with the correspondents they trusted most. The experience of discovering, in the course of the first year, qualities in themselves that the marriage had not required. The competence with figures, the capacity for managing complex situations without consulting anyone, the discovery that decisions she had assumed required another person's agreement could in fact be made alone, and made well. These discoveries were reported with a characteristic Victorian care, not as celebrations, not as criticisms of the marriages they had come from, but as observations offered in the honest register of a private letter to a trusted friend about what the year had revealed. The year has been a long time to live alone in a house with oneself, under sustained pressure, and the sustained pressure had shown things that ordinary peacetime did not. Across the private records of Victorian widows of different backgrounds, different wealth, different temperament, different marriages and different circumstances, certain observations appeared with a consistency that suggested features of the experience that individual variation did not dissolve. The first year was a spatial relearning, where things were, who was responsible for them, how the house worked when there was only one person running it. It was a temporal relearning, a new relationship with ordinary days, with the structure of weeks, with what a Tuesday evening actually felt like when organized around one person's requirements rather than two. And it was a linguistic relearning, a slow, resistant process of dropping the vocabulary of a shared life and learning to inhabit the grammar of a singular one. There were things the mourning system provided no guidance on. The system did not acknowledge this because the system did not in general acknowledge gaps. But the gaps were real. The specific quality of grief in the middle of the night, which was not the grief of the drawing room, which was not managed in the manner the drawing room required, which arrived when it chose and did not care about the calibrated surface the day had required, had no entry in any etiquette book. The experience of encountering an ordinary object that had been touched by the person who was gone, and finding that the object had acquired a charge entirely disproportionate to what it was, a book with a place marker still in it, a coat on a hook, was not an experience the visiting card tray was designed to address. The management of the household's grief, alongside one's own grief, in conditions that required one to be the person who was managing, was not a service available at 247 Regent Street. What the system provided was a surface. It was a very well-organized surface. The dress was precise. The visiting rules were clear. The stationery communicated the correct information to the correct people in the correct form. The timetable told everyone, the widow and the people around her, approximately where they were in a sequence that had a beginning and a middle and an end. But the surface was the full extent of what the system could contribute to an experience it could not enter. There is, however, a case to be made for the surface, an argument that a number of women who had been through the Victorian mourning system made in retrospect in their private correspondence. The argument was that the structure, for all its weight and precision, provided something that its absence would not have provided. A widow who lost her husband in the mid-Victorian period existed immediately within a recognised and legible social category. She was a widow. The community understood what this meant. The status carried obligations, the dress, the restrictions, the visiting rules, but it also carried permissions. She had a social permission to withdraw from ordinary life for a defined period. She had a recognised identity that did not require explanation. She had a framework that told her and everyone around her what the next 2 years was supposed to look like. Several Victorian widows, writing in retrospect about what the system had meant to them, described the structure not only as a burden, but as, in a particular way, a form of shelter. The shelter was heavy and sometimes felt punitive, but it was there, and in a period when very little about what had happened was clear, the clarity of the structure was not nothing. The first anniversary arrived. In the formal architecture of the Victorian mourning system, it was a threshold, the point at which first mourning ended and second mourning began, when the crape formally gave way to the softer blacks, when the social restrictions lifted slightly, when the calendar publicly acknowledged that a specific period had been completed. In the private experience of the widows who recorded it, it was more complicated than a threshold. It was a day that marked the passage of 12 months without making those months feel smaller. The year had happened. It had its own texture and its own particular hardnesses, and the anniversary did not change the fact that they had all occurred. What it changed was the widow's relationship to the year. It gave her the knowledge that she had been through all of it, that she knew what the mornings were like, and what the Sunday evenings were like, and what the particular quality of a Tuesday in the 3rd month was like. She had the whole year's knowledge now. She had not had it at the beginning. What she carried forward from the first year was not what the mourning system had been designed to produce. The system had been designed to produce a correctly dressed and correctly behaved woman who had moved through the prescribed stages and arrived at the point where ordinary life could resume. What it had actually produced, in the women who had managed it, was something more specific and more various. She carried forward a legal competence she had not previously needed, knowledge of how an estate was administered, how a trust instrument operated, how financial correspondence was managed and responded to, learned in the most demanding possible conditions and not easily forgotten. She carried forward a particular quality of social management, the ability to maintain a composed surface under sustained observation, to receive what was offered with the correct expression, to give what was required without giving more than that. She carried forward a specific attentiveness, a careful and practiced awareness of what things said and what they did not say. She had spent 12 months reading surfaces carefully, the surface of the visiting card, the surface of the condolence call, the surface of the solicitor's measured explanation. She had learned to notice the gap between the surface and what lay beneath it. This was, of all the things the year had given her, perhaps the most durable. She carried forward, too, a particular relationship to time. The mourning system had imposed a detailed and explicit temporal structure on the first year, the stages, the durations, the specific permissions attached to each. She had lived inside this structure for 12 months, aware of where she was in it, aware of what came next, aware of what the calendar was doing to the colour of her dress and the width of her stationery border. The result was a woman who had a specific and unillusioned understanding of how a year of managed experience felt from the inside. She knew what the system could do, she knew what it could not, she knew what she could do and what she could not, and which of those categories was larger than she had at the beginning expected. The first year was over, the morning dress was softer, the drawing room received a wider circle, the account books were familiar, the solicitor's letters were read and answered in the widow's own hand without hesitation. The house was quiet in the particular way of a house that knows who is in charge of it. What the second year would ask of her was not yet known, but the person who would answer the asking was not the same person who had stood at the beginning of the first year in the house that had gone dark. That person had been changed specifically and thoroughly by a year of experience that the system had organised and that the system had not been large enough to contain. The private diaries record something about this moment that the public face of Victorian widowhood does not. Not triumph. The word would have been as foreign to these women as celebration. Something quieter and more specific than that, and more earned. The sensation, noted in more than one account, of arriving somewhere that had not previously existed, of looking at the house and the account books and the correspondence and the particular face that has been maintained for 12 months in the drawing room, and recognising that the face and the house and the accounts were all now genuinely hers, not given, not managed on her behalf. Hers, because she had made them so, across the longest possible year, one day at a time. She was ready, in a particular and quiet way, for what came next. What stays at the end of something this long and this specific is rarely the large thing. It is rarely the law or the timetable or the commercial infrastructure of grief. Those are the frame. What stays is something smaller. The image of a widow in her drawing room, in the correct dress, at the correct stage of the correct mourning period, managing, composing, sustaining, learning, while also, underneath all of it, simply living through a year that no system was quite large enough to contain. The Victorian mourning system was not kind. It was not designed to be kind. It was designed to be correct, and correctness in this particular world was the only form of protection available. But the women inside the system were, underneath the crape and the visiting card conventions and the black-bordered stationery themselves, entirely, specifically, irreducibly themselves. The system moved over them like weather, and when it passed, they were still there. That is the thing worth knowing, not the dress, the person inside it. Perhaps tonight, before the thoughts begin their usual movement, there is something in that image worth resting in. A room, a woman, a year behind her. The account books closed on the desk, the drawing room quiet. The fire is low in the grate. Not out, just low, the way a fire gets when the house has settled for the night and no one has added coal for an hour. The light it gives is orange and unsteady. It moves across the ceiling in the particular way that firelight moves. Patient, unhurried, a little like breath. The chair she's sitting in has grown familiar. 12 months of the same chair, the same fire, the same hour of the evening. The house knows her weight now. The floorboards know where she walks at night. The servants know what she will ask for in the morning and have it ready. The crape is softer than it was. The gown is second mourning. A different fabric, a different weight, a different relationship to the light. Still dark, but softer. As though the material itself has learned, across 12 months of continuous wearing, to relax slightly. Outside the window the street is quiet. The lamp at the corner, the last few sounds of a Victorian city settling into its night. A carriage somewhere, the sound of it diminishing on the stones, then quiet again. The stationery on the desk has a narrow border now, much narrower than the first months. The paper is almost white. There's room for sentences again. She does not pick it up tonight. The fire moves. The ceiling moves with it. The room is doing what a room does when nothing is required of it. It simply holds. The furniture, the curtains, darker than they were a year ago because the light has changed in here. The quality of the light, the way it reaches across the floor in the evening and finds the places it always finds, the places that are always there. The letters in the drawer are her husband's letters. She has not moved them. She may not move them for some time. The year was real. Every part of it. The dress and the solicit and the visitors and the account books and the mornings and the Sundays and the Tuesday evenings. All of it was real, and all of it happened in rooms not entirely unlike this one. In ordinary houses on ordinary streets, in the middle decades of a century that had very clear ideas about how grief was supposed to look, and no particular interest in how it actually felt. The widows who lived through it left their records. Their letters are in boxes. Their diaries are in archives. Their visiting cards, the borders still precise and still communicating what they were made to communicate, are in collections, held by people who know how to read them, and by people who are only beginning to learn. She sits with the fire. The fire does not require anything of her. The room does not require anything of her. The night does not require anything of her. The crape on the curtains has faded slightly. Crape does this. It fades toward the edges first, loses its particular dull finish, becomes something closer to ordinary fabric. It is not gone, but it is beginning, at the edges, in the places where the light has touched it most, to become something else. This is what ending looks like in this particular world. Not a single moment, not a sharp edge, a slow change at the margins, so gradual it is almost impossible to say when it happened. And then one day, the room is a little lighter, and the woman in it is wearing something with the slightly softer border, and the year has done what years do. It has passed. The fire is very low now. The coals are mostly grey. The light from them is barely light. Just warmth, and the occasional small shift as a coal settles. The house is holding everything it has held all year. Quietly, without comment, as houses do. The breath in the room is even. The fire, the room, the night has arrived. Outside, the lamp at the corner is burning with the same steadiness it brings to every evening. This one no different from the ones before it. The light falling on the same stones in the same street, where ordinary life continues to happen, as it does, as it always does, on the other side of the window. She does not need to do anything now. The fire, the room. These women were real. The crape was real. The account books were real. The silver tray with its accumulation of black-bordered cards was real. They moved through a year that asked everything of them, and left them with something the year had not intended to give. If something in that stayed with you tonight, that is enough. Sleep well. I will be here when you come back.